Hello there and welcome to Bruxelles, Je t'aime, Euronews' weekly talk show about the week that was. On Brussels, my love, we zoom in on some of the stories making news across the continent. Hear what's at stake for you and for Europe. I'm Maeve McMahon. Thanks for joining us. Coming up this week, fury in France. The country of 68 million is knee-deep in divisions and reflection over the killing of a French teen during a recent police check. Long simmering issues of identity and inclusion now boiling over. We take a closer look, ask who is to blame and check if Europe has failed to better integrate minorities. And report cards for EU member states. The EU Commission presented its annual Rule of Law report this week, saying the situation across the EU was stable, even hailing some judiciary improvements in countries like Hungary. But with concerns of corruption, media independence and journalists even being spied on in some parts of this continent, we scrutinise how helpful this annual report really is. Our guests this week, Emmanuel Ashiri, policy expert on policing and migration at ENAR. Welcome.
Thank you.
Abir Al-Salani, Swedish MEP from the Renew Europe group.
Thank you for welcoming me.
Good to have you with us. And also Matteo Albania, Communications Director at Must & Partners. Welcome.
Hello, thank you.
Now, before we hear your thoughts, we just want to rewind back the clock, perhaps, for some context. Ellie La Liberté has more.
A wave of violence has shaken France after police shot a teenager dead during a traffic stop. The death sparked protests, which quickly degenerated into street fires, serious property damage, and even looting in many French cities. Tens of thousands of police were deployed, thousands of arrests were made, and many of those involved minors. Why all this fury? Protesters say it's systemic racism within the policing system. The government wants to subdue the violence. This fierce French conflict asks the question, what is the deep-rooted issue? Is integration in Europe a failure?
Ellie La Liberté reporting for us there. So I guess the first question to you all, what is the deep-rooted issue? What is your take on it?
I would first like to start by saying that we at ENA prefer not to use the term integration, because integration means bringing someone or group and assimilating them in a society, and we prefer to use the term inclusion, which means creating an enabling environment for people of different races, groups to actually live comfortably. And we think that the issue in France currently, this is not just about one death. This is not a coincidence. This is about systemic racism within French policing, but it's also about systemic racism within wider French society, which needs to be addressed. And I think that the human rights UN human rights body brought this up a couple of days ago, which of course was rejected by the French. We know in 2021 as well, a couple of human rights organizations, including Amnesty, Open Society and Human Rights Watch, had brought a case against the French police for systemic discrimination against blacks and Arabs.
But of course the French, we heard from Bruno Le Maire, the French minister, saying that the police force in France were absolutely not racist. And just on your use of that word integration, funny, the European Union has a plan and it's called an action plan for integration and inclusion. So you probably dislike that term. But let's hear from yourself. Let's get the MEP points of view around the table.
I think that these riots, these uprisings are just the symptoms of the disease that is at hand that we have in our societies. I'm from Sweden myself, and I very well know how it is to be outside and left outside the system, outside society. But we need to address the disease in itself. And it is actually offering equal opportunities for all. And the feeling, systematic feeling of being excluded, of not being belonging to this society, to this community, on one hand, but also not feeling that the police are there to protect me, that the law is there to protect me. We need to address that issue. Why do we feel alienated? Or why are these groups feeling alienated to the law that is there to protect them, to the police enforcement that is there to protect them?
And that's we're discussing here third generation French. I mean, they feel left out here and they also feel left out when they go back home as well. Matteo, what's your take on the situation?
I think that the economic growth that we've seen in Europe in the last decades has left out chunks of populations. I mean, not only third or fourth generations of North African people, but also Europeans. And when you leave out these big chunks of population, the result is that you're going to have discontent, you're going to have anger, and anger is going to translate in that because they left out, they've been left out, they feel they don't have the same opportunities. At the same time, we have to also to reflect on the fact that there is no European integration model. There is a France model, there is a Germany model, there is a Spain model, but there is not really one European model.
Indeed, and there might be this EU Commission plan on the table, but of course it is a competence of the EU member states. But I just want to bring in the opinion of a man who's been screaming from the rooftops for years about this issue. It's the civil rights well-known lawyer Juan Branco. He believes that nothing has changed in France since the riots of 2005. Take a listen.
There is clearly in France a problem of segregation in general, which has brought parts of society not to communicate with each other. And therefore, fantasies and violence rise from this lack of communication. Parts of France which are suffering very violently from the current policies that have been adopted in the last years or even decades related to the lack of public services and so forth. And this has created a lot of animosity, which bring parts of society to oppose each other instead of fight against the real responsibles of the situation. What is certain is that this policeman would have never behaved as such in one of the neighbors of the center of Paris. He would have never dared to treat as such a citizen of white color in a privileged neighborhood.
Juan Branco there speaking to our Paul Larocque-Oppenau. So I guess would you agree with that this would never have happened in a posh district like the 16th district, for example, of
But of
Paris?
course, I mean, there is structural discrimination. And if you don't take the mirror as a society and look at yourself with open eyes, taking in all perspectives, then you will not be representing everyone, and then you will be representing just a certain group. And this is, I think, what the French society has to do as a whole. Take a mirror and have a good look and invite everyone to participate in the discussion to improve the society for everyone. Maybe the persons with disabilities, maybe for persons with color, maybe for the ethnic French people as well, the chunk that you said they were left out. Everyone has to participate.
And has Emmanuel Macron, the French president, handled this well?
Well, I mean, it's handled in the French way. It's not the Macron way. And it doesn't matter who would have been the president, it will be handled in the exact same way, from the left to the right.
How should he be handling this?
The first thing is to listen to the protesters. Rather, what we are seeing is the instrumentalization of the criminal justice system to arrest many teens and use the criminal justice system to kind of deter people from going out to the streets to protest. I think it's also very important that an independent committee is set up to investigate this murder, because you cannot be asking the very same institution that is responsible for this systemic racism, the racial profiling, to be the very same system to deliver justice. People need to feel that they have confidence and trust in the French judicial system, and people don't feel that way currently in France.
At the same time, we need to actually address the violence.
I was going to say, how do you have a conversation with people when they're being extremely violent?
Yeah, it is very difficult, and I really, I mean, I believe in everyone's right to demonstrate, to, say their opinion, and that is how a democracy should be working. But then taking into violence, that is also taking it into the next step. And that's why we need really actually, or the French need really to do this in the proper way, because you do not want also to undermine the justice system. That is the only system that will, sustain.
But I want to add to that we should also listen to the reasoning of those who have in the last years been voting for the far right. I think that for too long we have been ostracizing them, and now we see that they are growing also in other countries, in Sweden. And for too long we have been thinking about doing, creating the cordon sanitaire in France, making sure that Macron or pro-European leaders were elected, but we failed to understand why these people were voting for these parties. We failed also to understand their concerns. We just thought that they were fueled by populism and by communication propaganda, but I think we did fail to listen to their concerns as well.
And these are the consequences.
Yeah, I mean, yes and no, because when you listen to far-right politicians like Marine Le Pen or Éric Zemmour, I struggle to understand what you want to listen from people who spew hate speech, from people who choose to blame migrants for the problems in Europe rather than actually looking at the systemic issues that are responsible for those issues. So I think that while it is important to have a conversation, while it's important to listen, we also need to have a conversation that is respectable, a conversation that values what we consider consider as European values, human rights, respect for other communities. But that is not the message we are getting from the far right.
Well, we have to listen to everyone's point of view, and we actually had the opportunity to speak to a man who is very close to Eric Zemmour and Marine Le Pen. He is the well-known, controversial perhaps, media commentator, Jean Messia, and he set up a crowdfunding campaign that brought about some 1.5 million euros for the policeman, for the legal costs of the policeman. And he feels that Niall, the 17-year-old teen that lost his life back in late June, he believes that he plays also a responsibility. Take a listen to this.
I consider Niall, and this is a fact, to be a multi-offender delinquent. So sure, he has a clean criminal record, but that's down to the laxity of the justice system, because he's been brought before the courts several times. The family should have done better from the outset to rein in their youngster. What family has a 17-year-old who drives around without a license in a luxury car worth 90,000 euros, and who, when the police call him to obey, decides to step on the accelerator? If this young man had simply complied, got out of his car calmly, and turned off the engine, he wouldn't be dead. In this case, Niall committed suicide. Nothing more, nothing less.
Jean Messia there speaking to our Paul Larocque-Oppenau. Reaction to that?
I mean, it's very strange and weird to hear him say this, because there are rules for a certain reason. The response to someone violating traffic rules is not shooting them point blank range. So while we could debate about whether Niall was raised the right way or not, and none of us can say that at this point in time, but the fact remains is that the response was unjustified, and the response was based on a racial profiling. The response is something which is also common as well in French policing. This is not the first time we are seeing this.
And we've seen studies from the FRA, the Fundamental Rights Agency, that back up that there is racial profiling taking place as we speak.
And I would like to ask
here
you, has he raised his children properly? Do we know that? Can he ensure me that his white-ass children never committed a crime, never used drugs, never beat anyone? He cannot guarantee that he can. But he is privileged, and that's why he doesn't need to justify his own upbringing of his own children. If they cannot see that they are privileged and they are using that position of power, then we are in deep problem.
So when people argue that there's the role, of course, of the parents as well to control their children, I mean, what role should they be playing?
But we inherit our parents' traumas.
But that's also the role of society. I mean, the parents of this, of Niall, they've been also growing up marginalized, probably, and that plays a role. Of course, that message is simplifying a fracture that exists, because the two crowdfunding that have been set up both for the boy that was killed and for the policeman really tells the story of this fracture that there is currently in France, and we cannot ignore that there is a fracture.
And we've seen the riots have calmed down, they've boiled down, but this story is going nowhere. I mean, this has been simmering for so long, and it doesn't look like anything could change anytime soon.
I think it's important to contextualize this and not make it about Niall committing a crime or parents not bringing up their children or society failing. We have to also understand that this is historic in France. We are talking of a country where in the 1960s over 100 persons were killed of Arab descent and thrown in the Seine River. Of course, the state has acknowledged it but has never apologized. This is the same country where in 1983, 3 army soldiers killed a person of color, which was considered as racial profiling. This is the same country where in 2005, 2 teens running away from the police died. This is the same country where in 2016, a person of color died while in custody. This is the same country that in 2020, we saw videos of a black music producer being beaten up by police and tear gas thrown into his studio. This is the same country where over 90% of lives taken over the last recent years are people of color. And black and Arab persons are 20 times more likely to be stopped by the police. So this is systemic. This is not about Niall. This is not about raising a child correctly. This is about racial profiling, and this is about the French state refusing to recognize that it is promoting racism within society.
And we've heard nothing out of Brussels on this story this week. There's been quietness from the Commission. I mean, should the European Union be standing up more for what we've just heard?
Well, to be honest, I mean, we had the same in Husby in Stockholm a while ago, some years ago, and I was the only politician who went out to that suburb meeting these youngsters, just to say that there is another Sweden that is prepared to listen. It's not only the police that will meet you. And that kind of leadership I lack. Either it is on the level of Brussels or in the level of France. I mean, how many councillors from the local council came to the riot or to these people to talk to them, or how many MPs. I mean, that is what you need, kind of a leadership that is offering another way out. We have to be there where people are, but we do not even consider them as proper voters. Their vote doesn't even matter. And that is the huge problem.
And as we've seen, it's been clearly politicised. I mean, we could see the consequences as well when people go to vote.
And I think that the Commission has not been saying anything also to not further fuel that politicization. And given the fact that Macron is the biggest political player in Europe right now, of course, they don't want to favorize any other opponent of Macron. That plays a key role. And usually the European Commission in Europe doesn't want to meddle when there are internal issues in member countries, rightfully so, because any word can be misinterpreted and can be mistaken and used by opposition parties.
But we also have to address the issue of the far right polarizing our societies, dividing them into two. I mean, that is a responsibility that they have to take. They are out there creating hate speech. They are out there, underbuilding the racism, and then they just go off free. I think that they have to be demanded of responsibility, because they are creating that gap in our societies. They are enlarging.
And a lot of that hate speech and misinformation, of course, is online. And we did hear from the French President Emmanuel Macron playing with the idea of perhaps turning off some of those networks and turning off the internet, in fact, during these situations. That's kind of illegal, though, right? I mean,
it's not only illegal. I think it's a scary thought. I come from Cameroon, a country where the internet has been shut down when protesters go out. I think that to hear a French president or to hear French politicians even play with such use or try to subtly say we are going to turn down the internet, I think speaks a lot to the direction that French society is going to. But we are not surprised, because in the past, when there's been protests, the French politicians have never really listened to people. And this is not only about this protest. We can talk about the Yellow Vest protest. We can talk about the protest recently about the retirement age. So it's a systemic issue where the authorities are not listening to the people. But I'd just like to come back to one question which you raised earlier, what Brussels is doing about this. It's hard to throw stones when you live in a glass house, because the issue of racism in policing is all over Europe. In Belgium, for example, we've seen Facebook groups where police officers are using racial slurs. In Sweden, there were reports of police officers using racial slurs against other police officers. We see the same thing in Hungary, in Poland. So it's really hard to say, France, you need to fix your problems when you have the same problems.
Emmanuel, you mentioned Poland. Quite interestingly, because I don't know did you see the tweet the other day from the Polish Prime Minister, Mateusz Morawiecki? Yeah. He shared his thoughts on the situation in France. He put out a tweet comparing his country to France. You can take a look there. He said, "Our plan is a Europe of security and public order, and these are the values from which everything begins." So making a comparison there between France and Poland in the video, comparing the recent events like the street fires and the looting to almost an idealistic life in Poland. I mean, shocking images.
Let us listen with the women, what they think about Poland, who are denied their autonomous right to decide over their bodies. I don't believe that everyone agrees with him in Poland among his citizens. So I don't.
But Morawiecki is clearly forcing his hand on these topics. There are elections coming up in Poland this fall. I mean, he's trying just to collect more and more consensus. I mean, these are the weapons, the tools that the far right uses. I mean, that's the rhetoric that the far right uses. I'm not surprised, I'm shocked, but I'm not surprised that they're going that far to compare Warsaw with Paris these days. We should be worried when this is going to go too far that we cannot control it anymore, that, it's going to get really out of hand.
And it's worth pointing out that Poland as well, last week at the EU summit in Brussels, was very much opposing the EU Migration Pact. The Swedish Commissioner Ylva Johansson, who's responsible for that hard-fought Migration Pact, was very critical of Poland as well on that. I mean, it's a
rightly so
continuous issue, rightly so, perhaps.
Yes. Yeah, well, because, I mean, both Poland and Hungary have been very, very problematic and unpragmatic in this, in the Migration Pact, and we cannot keep killing people at sea like that.
I'm afraid that is all we have time for on that topic, but do not go anywhere, because after the break we'll be hearing what European businesses make of the European Commission's Rule of Law report. Stay with us here on Euronews.